and I'm sure it's there where I got my love for nature. I was playing on the Franklin River before I knew it was the Franklin River. I was playing in the Tarkine before I knew it was the Tarkine. So those places were all really comfy, and that was really my happy place. I ended up joining the Navy when I was 15. And you know, I just always had this, we could call it adventurous spirit, but that doing this talk has kind of questioned what is adventure. And I think it's just a curiosity to find out what's out there, and a curious for me to push my body to see how far it can go in some places. So, and I've got millions of photos of all my adventures, but the photos that I've got, the really nice sunny days, there's no wind, there's no big swells on the ocean, and I find them, you know, they're all great for me, but I find them quite a boring photo to look at these days. To that point that I've deleted most of my photos of all my adventuring. And I work for Jess, I like telling stories, and I love adventuring. So rather than a bunch of photos, I've just got a few photos tonight, and those moments when you can't get a photo in anyway, when you're too busy on the ocean, or something's going on, or just something's affecting you in life where you just haven't got a chance to grab a photo or whatever. And that's what adventure has been for me. So I'm going to flick through. So I wanted to start with a quote from Helen Keller, and she said, "Life is a profound adventure or nothing." And that's kind of how, I only read that a few days ago, but it's kind of how I've kind of lived my life, you know. Everything's an adventure for me. If it's going to work, or walking out my front door, or going for a paddle in my sea kayak along the local coast here, I see kind of everything as an adventure, or just curious on what the day can be. And sometimes I've been in some wild places, but I only have to go out my back door in my kayak just to have an amazing adventure. I don't have to go to these wild places. So, I've just gotten back from paddling in the Whitsundays, myself and a bunch of mates, and this is a great story in itself. This bunch of mates grew out of, and many of you may have heard of that fella, his name was Andrew McCauley. He tried to paddle from Tasmania to New Zealand. He got within 50 kilometres of the island, and then just disappeared off the planet. His kayak was left behind, and him and I did a lot of adventuring together, so a lot of my early stuff was with him. So went to the Whitsundays, thought it was going to be, you know, behind the Great Barrier Reef, there wasn't going to be any big swell. You know, we knew there was trade winds, but that's just 15, 20 knots every day. I thought it'd be flat, calm oceans, but absolutely got my backside slapped a couple of times by nature. And I just want to pull one story out of each trip and a couple of photos. And this Whitsundays trip, because I thought it was going to be a gentle behind the reef and nice sunny days, and I took a double kayak along. And I took a mate who was inexperienced in kayaking. He's a great whitewater kayaker, but he's never been in a sea kayak. And so I took this big, long double sea kayak that I made myself. We had a couple of sails on board, which just turned it from a kayak into this amazing small sailing craft. And so just to give you a feel, my mate Scotty and I, it was about a 450 kilometre paddle we did over the few weeks. But I think we probably only paddled about 20. So it was just Scotty and I sitting in the kayak, travelling to the next island, and we hardly have to paddle. Where everyone else around us who was in singles, and they did have sails, and it looks nice and gentle, and we're just cruising along. But what I stupidly... Yeah, it's an old sail I was trying to squeeze the last little bit out of. It was fully made. Well, I didn't have two sails, you know, I don't usually paddle a double kayak, and I wanted to have two sails, so I grabbed the old one out of the cupboard and there was more repair tape than sail, I think. But it was an absolute hoot to turn a little kayak into a little sailing boat. And like these islands that we're aiming for, I don't know, 20, 25 k's away, and we just sat there the whole time. But as you can imagine, You know, there was the southeast trade winds, and they blow at about 15, 20 knots every day, consistently. But the 2 weeks we were up there, they were blowing 25 to 30 knots every day. And what we noticed was huge tides for an area. And as you travelled from one island to another, we would generally get these nice, flat, calm conditions. But as you got closer to the islands and you had the trade winds, you had a current, you had because the currents are getting squeezed and manipulated and wanting to go around the islands. So it was really just, and as it got squeezed in between islands, the waves just did this crazy reactions that you just weren't fully aware of, or you weren't anticipating, because it was just so random. You had the current, you had the wind, you had the waves, you had the tides, and they were all interacting together, and it made for some really, really uncomfortable paddling, especially, and this is the story, this is the northern tip of Whitsunday Island. We'd just come around a corner. We only travelled about 15 kilometres, but that 15 kilometres took us about 5 hours, only to find out by a commercial vessel around the corner who worked for national parks that they call the area around the corner that we just paddled the washing machine. And seriously, it was like being in a washing machine, and those waves were just absolutely just coming from everywhere. And because of the double sea kayak is so much longer than a single, it just didn't fit into the gaps between the waves. And so it was really hard to predict. With 2 sails on as well, it wanted to round up into the wind, so it made for really difficulty paddling. And probably the last 3 kilometres, it's calm as around this side, we come around this corner, and we're maybe a metre off from finishing this crazy paddle. We even had a catamaran going past us, and everyone, all the tourists were on board just taking photos of us. And we're going, what are they doing? But we got here 1 metre from the shoreline and the rudder falls off. You know, so, you know, we counted ourselves, had no rudder, you know, so I feel like we escaped. If we didn't have a rudder out there in such a long boat, it would have just been a crazy situation. Thankfully, it fell off just a metre from shore. We had it fixed within half an hour. The guys that were telling us about the washing machine worked for parks. They had a drill, they had a couple of bolts, and we just had it all done in no time. So yeah, those little times, those little bits of adventure that just, I actually don't remember much of the rest of the trip, or it doesn't stand out for me, except this one day in the washing machine, where at one stage, we're at the bottom of Scotty and I, relatively a small boat, a 7.5 metre boat, and all I had to say to Scotty was, I said, look what's coming, and we turn, and there was just this 4 or 5 metre face of a wave, and this wave just literally crashed on top of the whole boat. And we're just sitting there, and just straight after that happens, I had to say to Scotty, here comes another one. And this another huge, big, stand-up face of a wave just fell on top of us. The boat just handled amazingly. It's the most solid sea kayak I've ever had to be in. It was really enjoyable to paddle, except in those crazy conditions. And they're the days that I remember the most. You know, like everything in life, you know, you don't remember the easy days, I suppose. It's the cracking days that scare the crap out of you, that really stick there. So that was the Whitsundays passage, and a couple of, you know, just a couple of shots. And, you know, Whitsundays, we're going to Queensland, perfect one day, even better the next. Every time we pulled the tents out, it was raining. So every morning and evening it rained, every day. The winds just do not stop. And because of the big tides, sometimes you had to carry your boat like nearly a kilometre with all your gear. So it was trip, lots of carrying on this trip. Another thing that, you know, I like about getting away, you know, you get to be in nature and you can just have these moments like this. And I just caught my mate Scotty just sitting there, just soaking up the whole atmosphere. So there's a whole bunch of us that went on this trip, and we call these, and I was talking about Andrew McCauley. When Andrew McCauley died, we'd already been doing these crazy trips along the coastline and having a theme to our paddling trips. And when he died, we kept on doing these annual trips, and they become legendary, called chaos trips with a K. And some years that was a crazy idea. You weren't allowed to bring your watches or compasses or any radios. One year, if you wanted to cook, you weren't allowed to bring pots or pans or anything. You had to figure out how to cook it. One year, if you wanted bread, you had to bring all the ingredients. You weren't allowed to just bring bread. One year, you weren't allowed to land on a beach. You had to land on rocks. And but as we've got, and we've been going for nearly 24 years now as a bunch of fellas, and you know, as we've matured, our trips have also gotten a bit softer. And just at Christmas time, we all did the Franklin River in Tasmania, which I've got a few photos on and a bit to talk about. We thought we'd do an easy trip through the Whitsundays, which was far from it. And it's just been a fantastic thing to just always have that plan that every once a year that you spend a couple of weeks with mates and just get away and have a bit of a crazy adventure. There's the nice rain, Whitsunday Beach. So at Christmas time this year, as I was saying, I was lucky enough to go with all my mates and do a 10-day trip down the Franklin River. Before we did the 10-day trip, there was 11 of us on that trip, I think, on the Franklin, but 3/4 of us decided to paddle our sea kayaks to Strahan. Originally we went from Devonport and we were going to go up around the northwest and down to Strahan, but we only got to Stanley up the northwest and the wind was in the wrong direction. So we packed up the van and quickly drove down to Cockle Creek and then scooted around to Strahan via the southwest. And amazing, I actually haven't got any photos of that trip. It was just a trip to go from A to B in some wild weather and get to Strahan and do this trip. And I grew up on the west coast of Tasmania. I knew where the Franklin River was before I knew it was called the Franklin River. And to actually, I can remember my dad driving through Queenstown telling all the long-haired hippies who were protesting to go get a job. So it was always something that I knew about. I didn't have my dad's opinions, thankfully. And I got to do this 10-day trip and it was the most amazing thing that I've ever done. Nothing dangerously happened, but it was just the sheer magnitude of the nature. You know, it was just amazing. You know, if you've ever been in a rainforest, you know how special that is. But to be, and I have been in a few rainforests, but to be in a wet rainforest, it was just something else. And to see all those universes on universes and universes everywhere around us, and these old trees and just ravines and famous places that I'd seen through politics while they were saving the Franklin. It was just, for me, it was one of the best trips that I've ever done. And, you know, we lashed out a few grand each to be fully catered. And it's the first trip I've ever done anywhere where it's been catered, and it was just the best thing. You know, they were pulling out bottles of wine on day 9 and it was just fantastic, and the guides were great. And I tell you what, you don't need, the guide was from, I can't remember, somewhere in Europe. She was great. She'd been down the river hundreds of times as a guide. She couldn't even swim, but the trip, you don't need to be a crazy adventurer to go do something like this. They take kids, they take old people, you know, it's just something that I highly, highly recommend. And I just wanted to chuck that in tonight because the Franklin was just so amazing as a bit of an adventure. And the rapids, they are scary, but the volume of water is just crazy, and it keeps coming and it keeps coming. Just all the different, don't even know what that was. But every now and then, like that, and I'd sit there, and every now and then it'd just go, and a bit of dust, would come out, and it was just beautiful, and in this crazy, beautiful place. It's actually upside down. You can just see the ripples on the top.
Is that a lake?
Yeah, Lower Gordon, yeah. And just Tassie in general, you know, that's why this photo, that's what I was saying, so many photos are just for me these days. I don't know what other people get out of them. It's just the beauty in Tasmania. This is a hill that I got to look at as a kid all the time, and I never appreciated it when I was a child, but looking back on it now, it must have soaked into my being because it was so beautiful. Trying to capture the magnitude of the place, you know. And photos, maybe Jess's skills can, but definitely mine can't. You know, I just can't, you couldn't seem to capture the beauty of the place. It was, and in a way I didn't want to. I'd rather just etch it in my brain. And that was kind of the camping that we had along the way. That was just all in cliffs, the river just down there, roaring the whole time. It was like deafening the whole trip. And yeah, the food was great. The company was awesome.
Sorry, Lawrence, what were you in on this?
We were in rafts.
Was that like inflatable?
Yeah, an inflatable raft. And the beauty of the raft, like we went down some decent rapids. The guides actually said it was the best time to go down when we did. They said when it's got lots of water, you end up having to portage lots because it's too dangerous. Too low, you end up having to portage lots because it's too low. But we had it just right. We only had to do 2 pretty intense portages. But yeah, these big rubber rafts. And I actually, on the day 2, we went down what I thought was going to be this gentle rapid, and just the nature of the craft, the front half goes down first and then the second half comes down and then they spring back open, and I just got flung out into the water. And do you know, it was what I thought was just a little rapid, and that we had to wear helmets and everything. And I haven't done a lot of freshwater, whitewater paddling, and what struck me when I got thrown in was there was a log underneath. I hit my head on the helmet, and just how quickly it could all go pear-shaped in a river like that. And those guys are super professional. They know what they're looking for, the dangers. And did anyone see that ABC Four Corner special with the fella with the leg stuck?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I'm going to ask that.
Yeah, well, I've seen the spot.
Somewhere near there.
Yeah. So
It looks like that.
Yeah.
it's,
And he wasn't in the water, it was just a break.
It's insane.
yeah, insane. So yeah, what a trip.
How many people in each raft? Was there just how many rafts?
There was 4 people in each raft. 4 people in each, and we had 2 single inflatable kayaks that the fellas, we were all just mucking around in the rapids with, like a basic kayak. And this is the last day. And you know, we tied all the both rafts together, and it was about an 8-kilometre paddle. It was, thank God it wasn't windy, because these things are the most unaerodynamic thing in the world. But you know, you can see it's raining there. But it was just absolutely stunning, you know, the forest right down to the water's edge. And look, the only thing that I was disappointed about was the Huon Pines. You know, when you think, you know, it was so easy to go there and just think of it as virgin forest. But all Huon Pines been absolutely taken out of it. There's hardly any left, you know, so that's the one thing that's missing in that area.
Slow growing though. Really?
Incredibly slow growing, about, I think it's 1 millimetre a year. I actually went to Lake Pedder, and there, I have got a photo, but I haven't got it here. And they showed a timeline of a tree that was salvaged from Lake Pedder, and the tree was 3,020 odd years old, and they had a timeline of the planet and all things that happen on this stump of this tree, and that put it into perspective how old and big these trees can. Yeah, we had to wear wetsuits because it's bloody cold. The water's freezing. And, you know, drinking water, all we had was 1 cup, and you just dip it into the water and drink. Not many places you can do that in Australia anymore, so that was great. And, you know, all my mates, the fella in the back there, you know, he's an ex-river guide on that river, kayaked some of the biggest white water in the world, and he just absolutely loved the trip. It had everything. that's me at the end of the trip. I actually put it up on my Instagram post, and it was just trying to find a way to not go back to work on Monday. So yeah, I did that trip, went around Tassie a bit. It was just great. I love Tassie. The nature is just everything, and it was kind of home for me as well. And I climbed this mountain that I found, and I could literally see around the whole west coast of Tasmania, up around the northwest coast, and you could see all along the whole northern coast as well. Just getting out there doing things, I suppose. So that was the end of the Franklin trip. Another trip I did before the Franklin trip, at Christmas time I did, say, Hobart to Strahan. About 20 years ago I paddled Strahan to Hobart with a couple of mates. And I'll just leave that photo there for a minute. And this is where adventure can be in so many different kind of guises, I suppose. I was paddling, we pulled into Port Davey. We were going to have a couple of rest days there to just enjoy the place. And this was before the internet and weather forecasts on your phones and everything. So we pulled into Port Davey, had a rest that night, went to get a weather report off a cray fisherman in a small boat the next day. And that cray fisherman invited us on board. We'd already been out for a week. He quickly offered us beer, which we quickly said yes. And we sat there, and like I said, I'm Tasmanian. This skipper of this boat ended up knowing my eldest brother. This is an amazing story. This is an adventure in life, I reckon. Ended up knowing my eldest brother from when my eldest brother was still in Tasmania. When my eldest brother was 16, he got a girl pregnant, and he took off and left the state, joined the Hells Angels, in fact. But that's another story. This gentleman, this skipper, said, "You've got a nephew." I didn't even know, right? Because he knew my family. My eldest brother's 12 years older than me. He said, "You've got a nephew." And he ended up telling me this story of this nephew who at 17, not long before this trip, had just got his P plates, just got given a car, and stupidly, as lots of young men do, or lots of young people do, he went drink driving with a couple of mates in the car. And he crashed the car and killed his mates, and ended up going to jail for 8.5 years for manslaughter as a young man. And this skipper told me all about that, and it really touched me. I didn't know who this young person was. I had no idea who he was. My brother's a bit of a hard ass, so I decided that night to write this young person a letter, you know, saying, "You've got family out here, I'd really like to know you," you know, and gave it to that skipper, and he said he was going to give it to him. 20 years later, which was only 18 months ago, I get a Facebook message from someone who says, "I believe you wrote me a letter 20 odd years ago." That skipper put the letter somewhere in the cabin of the boat and just put it in there and forgot all about it. My nephew, 20 years later, buys that boat. He lives in Tasmania and was refitting that boat, finds the letter, because I had my name in there. He obviously knew his father's name, and he ended up contacting me via Facebook, you know. And after my trip down the Franklin and around down home, I went and met my nephew, and it was just one, you know, and an amazing adventure in life for all that to happen, to be in the middle of nowhere and meet someone. It just all lined up. The universe wanted us to catch up in the end, and so that was just an amazing experience from a little trip that I went in, you know. So we left Port Davey and that fella, and we paddled a bit further around Southwest Cape in Tasmania. We went to a bay called Ketchum Bay, and we sat there for a couple of days, and we were trying to get out to Matsyker Island, if anyone knows where Matsyker Island is. It's about 25 k's off the coast, the southern end of Tasmania. And I was with my good mates Andrew McCauley and Paul Loker, and we'd been waiting for the weather forecast, and it was Andrew's turn to get up to get the radio forecast from Telstra back in the day. And he gave us the morning forecast but forgot to tell us the afternoon forecast, and he didn't give us the afternoon forecast because he thought it might scare us and we wouldn't go. So I've circled, so this is just a random picture of Matsyka, the pinnacles they call them, just off Matsyka Island. There's the lighthouse. And just up here in this red circle, you can often find in bad weather crayfishermen or other boaties just anchored up, because believe it or not, it's quite sheltered in there. And I actually read I wrote an article for a magazine on this trip that long ago, and I reread that today. I hadn't read it in like 7 years. It was fantastic. So we paddled around, we left Ketchum Bay. We had a forecast of 6 metre swells and 20 to 25 knots coming from the northwest, so kind of blowing us towards the island, which was great. The Southern Ocean is known for its huge swells, and we absolutely got it. And the wind was okay, but just like I explained in that Whitsundays Island, when water compresses around an island or a rock or something like that, it just does all these crazy things. And this is a memory that's just so etched into my brain that I'll never forget it. We paddled around, and as we got closer to the island, we got closer, and Andrew's forecast that he didn't want to tell us came real, and we started copying a good 35 to 40 knots, and the swell would definitely picked up to probably 7 to 8 metres, so absolute giants, right? We couldn't paddle, once we got out there somewhere, we couldn't paddle around this way because of the wind. We could have gone all the way around the island to the lee side, but that was just too far, we didn't want to. And we decided to go through here, and the waves are just coming through here, and I decided to go first, and we were trying to pick a little gap through here that didn't look like the waves were breaking, except the wave that I decided to catch that day. And you can imagine a wall of water just coming across there. I had to throw myself in my loaded kayak just into this wave, like throwing myself all the way in there. And I got thrown for about 100 metres, just skipping down along this wave. And it was just this mad situation. And I can remember there was a cray boat there. That's why I've got it circled, and I've got it said in the article as well. I wanted to wake this cray boat up and say, look, have you just seen what I've come through? And so I sat there, I had a camera, and we were on the sheltered side. And this is the nice side. That's my mate Paul. And that's just coming around the corner, and it's got to be, and I think for me Tasmania's got the best sea kayaking in the world. You know, you can have these giant swells with sometimes not crazy white water, just these rocky coasts. It's here, our coastline, and Tasmania's just the best. And then we had to land, there's an old landing there, so we had to catch some waves up onto rocks amongst hundreds, if not thousands of seals, and then climb our way up to the top, up this crazy ladder, and we knocked on the lighthouse keeper's door. And there was a young, they have volunteers that come in there and stay on the island for 3 months at a time. The guy answered, and all he said was, how the F did you get here? You know, and they got a big viewing window, and we just paddled out through there, and he just thought, like, what the? You know, so there's another story a little bit later on, but this is one of the stories that are just absolutely, I can see the wave, I can feel the pressure of the wave pushing me down the wave and being fully engulfed, and taking this photo, and we actually landed and we were hooting and hollering because of what we just paddled through. So, changed tracks, you know. I was lucky enough a few years ago to work in Central Australia as a youth worker, and I was a long way away from the ocean. And I was really, really lucky. I got to work with young men every day, and I worked with the Lurritja people in Central Australia, about 350, 400 kilometres west of Alice. And this is just that whole episode of my life was just amazing. But this day, I'll never ever forget, it was an adventure of believing, seeing what I saw. So my job each day was to pick up an old man, a chilpie as they called him, and then fill up the troopie with as many young men as I could and go do something of culture on country. But this one was a bit of a planned trip. We were going out for 4 days, and we were camping out, and The only directions we had was the old fella. He'd point this way, point that way, just following him. And we eventually got to this site, maybe about 6-7 hours drive away through the desert. And there was this little puddle, I kid you not. And as soon as we all got out of the troopy, we all had to sing it, had to yell out our names and keep singing our names out. And the old fella went and sat down over a little bit and just sung, right? He just sung and sung. Stop, he'd help set up camp for a bit, but he'd go back and sing. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he starts yelling at the fellas to start cleaning little bits and leaves out and sticks out of here. And the goddamn little puddle starts flowing, you know? And, you know, we did this, cleaning it up. It just started flowing more and more, and I'm going, yeah, rightio. By the end of the couple of days, we're sitting in there was like little bowls falling down where the water was meant to be. And we were sitting in, that wasn't there a couple of days prior, but we were sitting in a pond of water that kept us cool, and I'd imagine back in the day fed water for everyone. And that was just to get back into the little township was called Mount Liebig or Wadianu, and only to be told by a couple of some men that the old man's job was to make water. You know, so he'd been out into his country that he hadn't been out in years, just to make this country work again, I suppose. And it was, you know, I've done some amazing adventures and stuff, but to witness that was just one of the ones where I just absolutely loved. I would say it was a spring, yeah, because it started bubbling at first. It was, you know, maybe a pond like this, and then he just sung, and then it just started bubbling, and then it started flowing, and then it turned into a little creek system. I felt really special. All right. So this is probably the deadliest trip I've ever done, to use a word. About 2008, 2009 summer, myself and two mates decided to paddle down the Antarctic Peninsula. We started up the very top at a base called Esperanza, an Argentinian army base, and we wanted to get all the way down here, and it was 3 years in the planning. The trip was called the John Riddick Rymel Memorial Expedition. No one in Australia has ever heard of John Rymel. He's the greatest explorer ever, Antarctic explorer ever. You know, everyone's heard of the Scots and the Shackletons. Well, they all stuffed up. People died and it never happened, you know. John Rymel, has anyone ever had Rymel Coonawarra? The wines? Oh, they own a Panola. They own a big winery in South Australia, the family does. But John Rymel lived, took a whole team, lived for 3 years on the Antarctic Peninsula, proved that it was a peninsula, not just an archipelago of islands. He's been credited with bringing sea kayaking from like the Inuit in Greenland to the Western world. He lived with the Inuit for a really long time, got all his survival skills, and had 3 years they lived down there. They had a hut, they took an aeroplane with them, they ended up mapping the whole peninsula, which is still used today. And such a boring story, no one knows about it. So because he was credited with bringing sea kayaking to the Western world from Greenland, and he was Australian, we thought we'd celebrate him and call our trip the John Rymel Memorial Antarctic Kayak Expedition. And it really helped us get some sponsorship as well. The Scott Polar Research Institute in the UK, they jumped on board and sponsored us. We made a little doco, Dick Smith, National Geographic, MacPac, Patagonia, they all jumped on board. And the whole trip was meant to be about 1,100 kilometres. We ended up paddling only to about there. This was always going to be, it's called the Adélie Strait, and it was always going to be the crux of the trip because even in a good ice year, it just chokes of ice and you couldn't get through, which we couldn't get through. But the most amazing thing I've ever done, the further it gets away from the time that I did it, I go, how did I do that? You know, like, there was so much in that trip, the planning, paddling in ice. We had maps, you know, we didn't have much internet back in that day. We had maps of the coast, but because it changes, the ice moves, and you know, that the maps didn't really fit where we were going. So, and we had no idea where we were going to go each day. Basically, we'd jump in our kayaks, we'd paddle for 6 hours, and then we would decide to try and find somewhere to stay after that 6 hours. That was our plan every day. Sometimes that turned into 20 odd hours of paddling before we found anywhere to stop. Camping on icebergs, camping in seal colonies, camping in penguin colonies, and we quickly learned if there were seals or the penguins and they could get out, we could get out where they could. Right, so an amazing, tough trip. Like, there was cold. It was so cold. It was so cold that I was just never warm the whole time. We had some amazing bits of equipment that was sponsored by us, by a company called Kokattat in the UK, who make dry suits specifically for kayakers, and that was a Gore-Tex suit, but somehow they'd managed to talk to NASA and get this underbody suit that some Polartec fabric, but the beauty of it is you could wear it every single day for 40 days and it didn't stink. Well, we didn't think anyway. So yeah, incredibly tough. This was actually the last day. We ended up bailing because we couldn't get further south, and one of the guys was really sick. He ended up coming with a rash all over his body, and we didn't know why, but he lost all of his energy. There's me looking out, a little bit younger. And you know, seals in the background. We learnt that when we landed on the beaches, if we acted like seals and barked at them, they'd go away. They're just dogs. And there's Andrew McCauley, who went on to amazing paddler. I've never met anyone with more ADHD than me, actually, but that fella was the most driven person that I've ever met in my life. And if there was ever really a description of an adventurer, I think he's the person that I would put into that description. And the other fella here is a good mate of mine, Stewie Truman, who's a Welshman, and he came back from that trip and paddled all the way around Australia and Tasmania, and he was a great guy. I just did that trip in the wet Sundays with him. We started the trip, you can see Andrew's got like sailing boots on, but Stuart couldn't fit his feet into his kayak with the sailing boots. So we managed to steal some boots from a Chilean army base, and they gave us some boots. So, but that's basically how we lived for 42 days. In our Gore-Tex suits, with our puffer jackets on, in our little tents. And I can remember this day, it's just absolutely howling 60, 70 knots out the back, and we're just tucked away in the back. And you might see it, Stuart's sucking on a pipe. I've never been so jealous of someone smoking before. It looked warm, you know, and he was sucking on a bit of smoke coming out every now and then. It just looked warm. So,
When did you do this?
2008, 2009, summer. It was an extended trip. We left just before Christmas and we got back about end of February, I think.
So you went across the Drake, you know, ship.
Yeah, we went across the Drake. Another adventure. We ended up hiring this business, a famous sailor who does lots of sailing in the Sydney to Hobart, a female by the name of Kangarutha Farm, and we got to go on a yacht named the Spirit of Sydney, which was designed by Ben Lexon. It was raced single-handed around the world in the BOC Challenge by, who's the fella that does clean-up? Ian Kiernan. And yeah, designed by, and commissioned, and you know, the champagne bottle was done by Bob Hawke. So 60-foot aluminium vessel, and sailing across the Drake Passage. If anyone's ever heard of the Drake Passage or into sailing, It's a bit of land between South America and Antarctica, and it's a bit like Bass Strait. You know, they were joined up once upon a time, and it's really shallow, so the ocean, especially the Southern Ocean, just goes crazy through the Drake Passage. And the trip down was just a separate adventure. On the way back, it was just as mad, and it was so strong and rough, the seas, that in one 24-hour period we made 1 nautical mile on the way back. But here's the kicker of this one. On the first day of this trip, we're leaving this base called Argentinian base Esperanza. It was a beautiful day. It was a record for warm temperature in Antarctica. It was like 16 degrees. Beautiful day. Bit like today, you know, 16 degrees, calm ocean, fully loaded kayaks with, 52 days worth of feed, ropes, movie gear, cameras, everything. We were overloaded in our kayaks, and this is somewhere where we, as pretty much professional kayakers, we really stuffed up with this. And so we left Esperanza, paddled about 5 kilometres down the coast, and there was this big giant bay, you know. And normally in our sea kayaks we'd probably maybe not hug the coast, but we'd go fairly close and follow the geology around. But because we were so loaded and we really wanted to push on, we decided to go point to point. And that bay was probably, 20 k's deep, and maybe a third of the way over, and there was a gentle 10-kilometre wind, 5 knots, and all of a sudden we could hear this freight train just coming. You couldn't see what it was. And has anyone ever heard of katabatic winds? No? So you know the nor'easters that we get here, the sea breezes. It's the opposite in cold environments. You know, the sea breeze comes into the land. In a katabatic wind in a polar region, the air gets sucked from the land, from the highest point, down, and it gathers strength as it goes out to sea. And they're called katabatic winds. And we could hear this katabatic wind coming before it hit us. And we're 20 k's out to sea. We're probably only 7-8 k's into our paddle first day. Don't need that. Halfway across, we could hear that wind, and all of a sudden we've gone from gentle 5-10 knots of wind to maybe 60, 70, 80 knots of wind. It was uncontrollable. Within 5 minutes we're all separated, and it was game on. It was a matter of survival for about the next 20 hours for myself. For one of the other guys it was a good 27 hours, and for Stuart it was 19 hours. And you know, where I was saying it was a big deep bay, I drew a line in my head, and I knew that if I went outside that line, outside that bay, I was a dead person. You know, I was just going to get blown out to sea and God knows whatever. And surprisingly, because of where we were, we decided not to wear life jackets. And that's, like, who's going to rescue you anyway, you know, so what's the point? And believe it or not, they're a little bit uncomfortable when you sea kayak. So yeah, I paddled for hours and hours. There was, you know, a flat sea, was small bits of chunks of ice just getting thrown, landing on your boat. I was scared for my life. At one stage, I was yelling out, "I don't want to die, I don't want to die," and just using every muscle in my body to try and stay in that bay, you know. I knew if I went out, I was gone, you know. And
See where you were going, like coming out.
no, it was just white in front of you. You know, it was just white cliffs, white snow, white sky. There was nothing there to visualise except this strong wind and maybe a kilometre visibility, I suppose, at most. And yeah, it was just wild. You know, no mates to talk to. You couldn't take your hand off to use the sat phone to ring anyone or anything. Yelling out, "I don't want to die, don't want to die." And right in that moment when I yelled out, "I don't want to die," I had this vivid memory. I had my darling wife at home at the time, and I said to myself, "You can't die. Nadia will kill you." You know, so... And as the hours went on, and it was hours of just just trying to get on top of the wind, and I just inched my way closer and closer to shore. And because they were just big ice cliffs, there was just a point, like the wind must have gone up and then up over some of the ocean and then just hit it. And all of a sudden I just paddled out of the wind, and I was just in calmer water underneath the kind of cliffs, the big ice cliffs. And I rested there for maybe a minute because I just knew, and I decided, I'm just going to go back to the beginning. Up until that point I didn't know what I was going to do. I was just paddling for survival. I paddled maybe 2 kilometres heading back. I go around a little point, and here's my mate Stu just sitting there in his kayak, and he sees me, and we're both going, yeah, great. And had a quick catch up. What happened? Got separated. Same story. He'd been waiting there for a little bit. He hadn't gotten to land. He got to the shelter maybe at the same time as I had. We waited about 2 minutes for Andrew. It was just too cold to stop and just wait. So we just made it back, got to the army base, sat there just absolutely demolished for a good half hour before we decided to go tell the Argentinian army. And the commander of the base just shrugged his shoulder and said, what do you want us to do? And there was nothing to do. So we went back to our boats and we sat there for another half hour, and we decided we better phone Vicky, Andrew's wife, and say, well, this was 27 hours after we got separated, and we were going to phone her and say, look, we can't find Andrew. And Stuart and I can't remember what we tossed, but we tossed something to see who was going to pick up the sat phone and phone Vicky. He lost, and he was just dialing the numbers, went down the coast a little bit. We could see this colourful thing coming, and we quickly worked out it was a kayaker, and we worked out that Andrew, he'd got blown out of that bay and he got blown down the coast, and he came, instead of us going back to the beginning, he came up to the beginning, and that was day one in Antarctica. And we didn't paddle for a couple more days, but that day, that Matt Syker day, are the two days that I'll never forget. And Stuart and I, we actually sat in this Whitsundays trip, and he had a whiskey and I had a beer, and we talked about that day, and it was such a deep reflection on what we went through that day as well. Yeah, that's the kind of camping situations that we got. Landing in a seal colony. There's no grass down in Antarctica. Camping on rocks sucks. There we are, a bit on the water. It was very early digital camera technology. I had a digital camera, but it was so white down there that it just the computer of the chip of the camera just couldn't keep up with it. And we were sponsored by the Rainbow Power Company from Nimbin. They gave us batteries and it was awesome. And so that's kind of my end of my talk. But another little adventure was I was gifted this boat a couple of years ago. Her name's Sailing Vessel Flo, and my dream and hope is sometime next year to jump on her. And has anyone ever heard of and I'm only going there because it sounds so cool, it's called Point Nemo. It's the oceanic point of inaccessibility. It's the furthest that you can be on the planet away from people and land. In fact, the closest people are the people in the space station as they go overhead. Sorry? Somewhere here, between here and South America. So, so that's me.